Share the screen. Oh, okay. Back it up one. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing the placement and Penn data in the IEP. This is again presented by the ARC of Northeastern Pennsylvania's Advocacy Department. So placement. Placement is the last decision to be made at the end of the IEP meeting, towards the end of the IEP meeting, after you've already discussed the present levels, the goals, and the specially designed instruction. So placement should never be predetermined based on the student's disability. You should not walk into the first or subsequent IEP meetings with everything already decided in terms of placement. Parents are a part of this decision process and equal members of the IEP team. So they definitely and should have input into the placement of their child for special education services. The least restrictive environment must be considered in the placement proceedings to decide what placement is going to be for the child with a disability. What is decided on the IEP in terms of placement should match what is on the NOREP, which the parent is agreeing to. So those should be the one and the same. And it's just really important to remember that special education is not a place, it is a service. So when they say placement, we're going to get into detail exactly what that means, but just remember that. Okay, so placement is in section 7, and there are 3 subsections, A, B, and C, in the IEP. So if you note on your annotated copy or your student's IEP to turn to this section, and this is what we'll be discussing. So placement is educational placement of the child. And there are questions for the IEP team that must be discussed and answered in this section of the IEP. Section B is the amount of special education support and the type of special education support. And that may differ from eligibility category. While your child may qualify under one type of disability, the amount and the type of disability may differ. What's appropriate, what type of support is not the same for every student with that same disability. So that's why it may differ. One child with autism may need an autism support. Another child may need learning support. The child may receive more than one type of special education support. And it's very important to also note in this area type of special education support, any kind of age ranges, because there are regulations to how many students can be in each type of classroom placement, depending on age. So this is where this would be noted if there was an age range difference. So just to make you aware that the maximum age range in specialized settings shall be 3 years for elementary age, which elementary is considered kindergarten through 6th grade. And then that's 4 years for secondary ed, which is grades 7 through 12. So a student with a disability may not be placed at a class which the chronological age from the youngest to the oldest student exceeds these limits, unless there's an exception determined by the appropriate IEP team of that student, and they have to justify that in the IEP, and the parent would have to be aware of this and agree to that. So this should be noted in the placement section if your child is going to be in with a greater age range difference, which can occur at times. Now, part C is the location of support. So it's going to list the school district and it's going to list the building location. And at neighborhood school always must be considered first. And if it's not considered first, that should be checked and a reason why should be listed. So now we're going to talk a little bit about least restrictive environment. So as we mentioned before, the least restrictive environment should always be started with and considered first. And that should be considered with all supplementary aids and services the child might need for them to be successful in that least restrictive general education classroom. The student should have access to general education curriculum and same age peers. Note, modification is acceptable in general education classrooms. Students do not need to be able to do exactly what the other students are doing. Keyword is access. It should be, like we mentioned on the last slide, in your neighborhood school to the greatest extent possible. So the school they would attend if they did not have a disability. Funding or staffing cannot be a reason to exclude. So we can't say the student cannot attend the general education classroom because we don't have any staff to send with them, or we don't have any money to fund another teacher and there's too many kids in that class, or any kind of money or staffing issues. We do understand that, the reality is that there are not enough teachers, related service providers, and paraprofessionals and such, but they have to come up with a plan and work to how to figure that out, rather than saying we can't do it because we don't have the money or the staff. Equal opportunity to participate in extracurricular activities, lunch, recess, assemblies, and other school events is very important for students with disabilities. And like we said, that it's not all or none. So where does the student have those opportunities? So sometimes you're going to look at some of these other areas if the academics area is not going to work out. Explanation in the IEP should say the extent to which the student will not participate in the regular education class and the general education curriculum. So that's two separate issues being looked at, the class and the curriculum. So regular education class with their typical peers, or also the general education curriculum. So there may be students that are in a regular education class, but learning a modified curriculum, or there may be students that are in a special education class learning the regular general education curriculum and state standards. 4 questions to be considered by the IEP team would be, they must be addressed at the IEP meeting to determine the appropriate placement. So these are the questions that need to be considered for all students, all supports and services, and is explaining what is considered and why the student will or will not participate. So you will discuss these questions at your IEP meeting, and they will be interjected into the placement section of the IEP, the answers to these questions. So you may see it in a different format and a different explanation on your IEP, but these are the questions that under the regulations must be addressed. So what supplementary aids and services were considered? So the student must be able to attend to the maximum extent appropriate with students without disabilities, including those at public and private schools or other care facilities educated with students who are not disabled. So what kind of services and supports are we considering, and which supports and services we feel are rejecting because they would not work? And we have to explain why supports and services will not enable the student to make progress on the goals and objectives in their IEP in that educational class. So really have to delve into why these supports and services cannot have them reach their goals satisfactorily. What benefits are provided in the general education class with supports and services versus the special education class? So what are those differences between the two classrooms? Why would one benefit the student over the other? To what effects might be expected on the student with disabilities or the other students in the class, even with supplementary aids and services? So how would the student be able to be educated in the regular education classroom, how that affects the other students in the class? Are the supports and services available enough to warrant that they would not be in this class? And the last one is, to what extent, if any, will the student participate with non-disabled peers in those extracurricular or other non-academic activities? So if they're not able to, work on their goals and it's not going to receive educational benefit in the general education classroom, what other ways could we have the student participate with their peers? Because again, we have to make sure that, that it's only the nature or severity of the disability that warrants the education take place outside of the general education classroom. So we'll see a series of boxes on the IEP, and they'll mention in there what else was considered and why that was not appropriate. So for example, they may have said we considered a full general education classroom without any supports. That will not be effective. The student will not be able to learn. We've considered a learning support environment, and maybe that has too many student ratio numbers are too high and the student has more significant needs. So this is why we've considered autistic support with smaller number of students, a more available paraprofessional, etc. That's just an example. But you really need to, there needs to be more discussion in this area in these IEP meetings for these 4 questions as required. So next slide is the amount of special education. So here is where we talk about itinerant, which is special education supports and services provided by special education personnel for 20% or less per school day. So that's the minimum level of support. Supplemental would be special education supports and services provided by special education personnel for more than 20% of the day, but less than 80%. So somewhere in that middle range. And full-time is special education support and services provided by special education personnel for more than 80% of the day, or more 80% or more of the school day. Next slide is types of support. So classroom options, but you may also get these types of support in a general education class as a push-in or a pull or a small group. So some classroom options that may be considered a part of the placement discussion would be a life skills support, which is services for students with disability who require services primarily in the areas of academic, functional, or vocational skills necessary for independent living. Learning support, services for students who require services primarily in the areas of academic, functional, or vocational skills. Oops, excuse me. Often you see this as specific subject material classroom, or they're getting small resource room-based help with academics. Autism support, services for students with disability of autism who require needs primarily with communication, social skills, or behaviors consistent with autism spectrum disorders. The IEP for these students must address as need identified by the IE team include appropriate verbal and non-communication needs of the child, social interaction skills, response to sensory experiences and challenges may also, or positive behavior supports or behavioral interventions. Students sometimes might go to this type of class, maybe even just for a social skills group or for behavior support. Multiple disabilities, services for students that have more than one disability, which severely impairs their learning for academic, functional, or vocational skills. Emotional support, services for students with disability who require services primarily in the areas of social or emotional skills development or functional behavior. And some other options would be, again, these aren't classrooms, but speech and language for students with speech and language impairments who require services in the area of communication or assistive technology for speech and language communication, blind or visually impaired for students with visual impairment, including blindness, orientation, mobility, and the use of assistive technology for visual impairments, Braille system, writing needs or ways to help with reading. Physical support, students with a physical disability require services in the area of functional motor skill development. Adaptive physical education would fall under here, or use of assistive technology for physical support. Deaf and hard of hearing services for students with a disability of deafness or hearing impairment require service to address areas of reading, communication, use of assistive technology in those areas that are deaf or hard of hearing. And these students must include a communication plan to address the language and communication needs. So all these different areas are different types of support that will be considered in the placement section in discussions of your IEP. Sometimes the student may have more than one and may have a couple of these, and they may be in one classroom and the general education classroom, and then pulled out for speech or speech pushed in. So it could be combinations of different levels of support and different types of support. So next is the Penn data. And then when we get a little bit further on, we're going to discuss the 2 differences. But the Penn data reporting is in section 8A or B. This differs from placement percentages. Section A is regular school buildings with non-disabled peers. It indicates the time inside the regular education classroom. So that's difference from the placement is that measuring the time in special education, the Penn data is measuring the time spent in the regular education classroom. So to find out this placement percentage in terms of reporting is total number of hours in the regular classroom divided by the number of hours in the school day. And that includes lunch and recess. And then you multiply it by 100. This reporting is required by the U.S. Department of Education. And again, it's on an educational environment they're trying to measure, not the amount of special education service time. So they're measuring the amount of time that the student is spending in the educational environment. It's compiled and submitted to the IU by your school district for verification, and then submitted to the PA Department of Ed. And you can get your data on your school from Penn Data Report. You can really just Google it, but it's like a website. It was designed and developed exclusively under the contract from the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, Bureau of Special Education, by the Pennsylvania State Data Center, part of Penn State University. And you can find really all kinds of different data on the school district or your IU with this reporting tool. So now I'm just going to show you, this is just like a little snapshot example of what you can pull. Again, you can pull it on your IU or your school district. I just pulled this. This is the Scranton School District, and the most recent is 22-23. And information included in here is the LEA, which is the school district, their total enrollment. And then it also gives you the state numbers. So the total special education currently is 2,090 students. Special education is 22.5% of the student population in this district, where 19.3 is the state level. So you can see they have a higher population of special ed. If you look at the special education enrollment by disability, you can see all the different categories that we mentioned, the classifications. And you can see that specific learning disability is the highest, and that's also statewide the highest. You can also see, a lot of another one that's often high is the other health impairment. So we're pretty much on this district is pretty much in line with the states. And then speech and language impairment. This is all levels and itinerant, supplemental, and full-time. So you can gauge those numbers to see if the district's percentages are. There's also race and ethnicity, school age information. I did a little snapshot, so you can't see all the different ones, but you can kind of get an idea of what your school district's made up of. And then you can see the placement, the educational environments that are reported from the Penn data, and see that special education inside the regular classroom for 80% or more of the day, very high. So those are those itinerant and supplemental students that are in the general education environment most of the day. And then inside the regular classroom, less than 40% of the day. And then in other settings. So again, next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the other types of settings that will be reported if your child is outside of the regular education school district building. So here's the Part B. If they're not reporting if the student is not in the home school district receiving instruction, then they're going to report on the second section, which is Part B, outside of the regular school building. And again, you have to remember this is the time inside the regular classroom. So these students are not in the regular education classroom at all. So for this reporting. So there's a bunch of different different placement locations that they're reporting on, and this is just a list of them. Instruction in the home. So a teacher is coming to the house and the student is at home due to some type of reason separately from homebound, which would be the next reason, which is homebound is like, or in the hospital is because you're medically can't be at school. Instruction in approved private schools. So if your school district is sending you to a private placement and they're paying for that and they're following the IEP, that would be a private school, a private facility, maybe like an RTF facility. Instruction in out of state facility, meaning like you're we're in New Jersey instead of in Pennsylvania, for example. Instruction in another type of facility or a correctional place or a prison or any other type of facility doesn't fall into those categories. So they do need to report when that is occurring. And it is based on yearly numbers because the yearly IEP. And then here's just some information on the different calculations because it can be very confusing. And I know sometimes IEP teams are also confused about how to figure out the placement versus the Penn data or one over the other. So this just kind of breaks it down. Placement, again, is the amount of special education. Penn data is the amount of time in the regular education. So that's the differences. Note the percentage differs from Penn data. Less than 20%, greater than 20%, but less than 80, or greater than 80% is the placement configuration. So if you're going to be itinerant, you're going to be less than 20, supplemental 20 to 80, or greater than 80 would be full-time. But on the Penn data side, if you're inside, you're going to be differing. It's going to be inside the regular classroom, 80%, 79 to 40%, and then less than 40 is full-time. So that's a little bit of differences. So it may be that you're supplemental for the placement, but the Penn data, you're considered full-time. Time receiving services from all special education professionals is contained in the placement information. So when they use that formula to figure out what amount you're receiving, they're going to take all the services from special education professionals, except for the paraprofessional and the PCA. So if you're in the general education classroom and your PCA accompanies you and you're not getting any kind of special education instruction from a special ed teacher during that time, or then it's not going to be counted. In the Penn data, they're going to be like considering community-based instruction. If you're in a, say, an ESL class or job placement, that is part of general education time because even though it's not in the school building, it is still part of, in the general education. You're not getting instructed, or you're not in a private placement or something like that. So you're not, you're in the regular community. Regardless of location, placement, general education classroom, resource room, or self-contained classroom. So it's not going to matter where that special education takes place. It's just that it's taking place to be counted. And again, like we mentioned earlier, it has to be the same as on the NOREP. Your NOREP shouldn't say something that's different than that's actually in the IEP. And in the Penn data, the section B is for those spending more than 50% outside of the regular school building. They have to report where that's happening. So that pretty much sums up the placement in the Penn data. Again, we know these are very quick and concise, and so we like to leave time at the end for question and answers. We will have the recording available in the slides for you to refer back to get further information. I'm sorry, I apologize. I have a cold, so my head is in the clouds. I'm very stuffy today. So if anybody has any questions, I'll stop the recording. And I know we have a small group today. We could talk about anything that we talked about today that you might have a question on, or you're not understanding, or if we went through it too fast. We definitely have time to review that. And I thank you all. Here is our contact information. If you have any questions, we're available. If you need advocacy services, we're available to help with that as well. Please reach out to us at any time. Thank you.
I think Alyssa has a question. Go ahead, Alyssa.